In 2021, Russia sold China 79 million tons of crude oil. By 2024, that number had climbed to over 108 million. On paper, this looks like a partnership deepening. But look at what Russia gave up to get there. It agreed to price its oil at a discount to global benchmarks. It agreed to be paid in yuan, a currency it cannot freely spend. And it agreed to a pipeline that goes to exactly one customer. Here is the argument I want to make. The China-Russia relationship is not an alliance between two great powers. It is the construction of a dependency, and Russia is the dependent one. By the end of this video, you will be able to see the specific mechanisms that made it happen, and why they are close to irreversible. This matters beyond the two countries involved. If Russia is genuinely a junior partner rather than an equal, then almost every Western assumption about how to pressure Moscow is aimed at the wrong address. Sanctions are designed to isolate an independent actor. They work differently against a state whose economy has been folded into a larger one. And a Russia that cannot say no to Beijing is a very different problem than a Russia acting on its own strategic calculation. So the question of who holds leverage in this relationship is not academic. It determines whether the tools being used against Russia can work at all. For most of the 20th century, the relationship ran the other way. The Soviet Union was the senior partner, exporting industrial equipment, weapons designs, and ideology to a much poorer China. The Sino-Soviet split of 1961 was, among other things, a fight about who would lead. Then the economies diverged. China's opened, industrialized, and compounded for 4 decades. Russia's remained heavily dependent on hydrocarbons and never successfully diversified. Today China's economy is roughly 10 times the size of Russia's. That gap alone does not determine the relationship. Plenty of small states deal with large ones on decent terms. What matters is whether the smaller party has alternatives. Which brings us to the first pillar of the argument, infrastructure. Russia's pipeline network was built westward. For 50 years, the pipes ran toward Europe, and that was a genuinely strong position, because Europe was many customers. Germany could not easily coordinate with Italy to squeeze Moscow on price. Power of Siberia, which began deliveries in 2019, runs east. It connects Russian gas fields to a single buyer. There is no branch line, no alternative terminal, no second country at the other end. This is the difference between selling into a market and selling to a customer. When you have one buyer and they know it, you do not set the price. Reporting on the pricing terms has consistently indicated Russia sells this gas well below what European buyers paid, and Beijing has been in no hurry to commit to the proposed second pipeline. That reluctance is itself leverage. Every year the second line stays unbuilt is another year Moscow needs it more. The second pillar is less visible and more binding, the currency. After the 2022 sanctions cut Russian banks out of dollar and euro clearing, trade with China shifted heavily into yuan. This was reported as a triumph over Western financial power, and in a narrow sense it was. Trade continued. But consider what a yuan balance actually is. The yuan is not fully convertible. Beijing controls the capital account. Russia can spend those yuan on Chinese goods, or hold them in Chinese instruments, or convert them at terms China influences. So Russia sells a real, finite, physical asset, oil and gas that can only be extracted once, and receives in exchange a claim that is mostly spendable inside the buyer's own economy. That is not trade between equals. It is closer to a company town, where the wages come back as store credit. And the goods flowing back reinforce it. Russia's imports from China are increasingly machinery, vehicles, and electronics, precisely the categories where a supplier can create dependency through parts, servicing, and standards. There is a fourth mechanism, and it is the one that converts a trade relationship into something closer to supervision, the banks. After 2022, Russian institutions needed Chinese banks to clear payments. But Chinese banks of any size also operate in dollar markets, hold correspondent relationships in New York and London, and have far more revenue at stake outside Russia than inside it. So they behaved exactly as commercial institutions do when facing asymmetric risk. Reporting has repeatedly described large Chinese banks tightening compliance on Russian transactions, delaying payments, and in some cases declining categories of business outright, not because Beijing instructed them to, but because the downside of secondary sanctions dwarfed the upside of Russian fee income. That is a specific and underappreciated fact. The constraint on Russian payments is not being applied by the Chinese state. It is being applied by Chinese banks' own risk committees, responding to Western regulators. Which means Russia's payment access depends on decisions made by commercial actors in a third country, weighing exposure to a fourth. Moscow has no standing in that process at all. The workaround has been to route through smaller regional Chinese banks with no Western exposure, which works, at higher cost, lower volume, and greater concentration. So each step of adaptation narrows the channel. That is the shape of a dependency deepening rather than resolving, and it happened without anyone in Beijing deciding anything. The fifth mechanism is the one that decides whether any of the others can actually be executed, who insures the cargo. Crude does not move because a contract exists. It moves because a vessel is insured, and marine protection and indemnity cover has historically been concentrated in a small number of Western clubs. When that cover became unavailable for Russian cargo, the trade did not stop, but it moved on to older vessels with opaque ownership and non-Western insurance, at higher cost and with a different risk profile. Here is why that matters for the dependency argument specifically. Russia now depends on a shipping and insurance layer it does not own, that is expensive to maintain, and that exists at the sufferance of the jurisdictions where those vessels call and transit. Every port state along the route acquires a small veto. Every insurance regulator acquires leverage. None of those parties are Russian, and none of them are Chinese either. So the logistics of the redirection carry a permanent tax that the headline crude price does not show. Analysts examining Russian export economics have consistently noted that the discount to Brent understates the true realized loss, because transport and insurance costs rose alongside it. That is the fifth layer. It is not enough to find a buyer and a currency. You have to be able to physically deliver, and the delivery system was the part Russia had least control over to begin with. Now the strongest case against everything I have just said, because it is a real case and it deserves a proper answer. The counter-argument goes like this. Russia was facing the loss of its entire European market, its largest customer, gone almost overnight. China absorbed that shock. Without it, Russian state revenues would have collapsed, and with them the ability to fund anything at all. A discounted sale to a single buyer is enormously better than no sale. On this reading, Russia did not become a client. It found a lifeline, and paying a premium for a lifeline is rational. That argument is correct on its own terms, and I want to be clear that Russian oil revenues did hold up better than many predicted in 2022 and 23. But it answers a different question than the one I am asking. It explains why Russia took the deal. It does not establish that Russia retains leverage inside it. A lifeline you cannot let go of is, definitionally, a dependency, and the test is not whether the arrangement helped in the short term. The test is what happens when the two parties disagree. And here the asymmetry shows. China has other suppliers, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Angola, the entire seaborne market. Russia's redirected volumes have nowhere else to go at anything like the same scale. When one side can walk and the other cannot, the pricing follows, regardless of what the communiques say. If the dependency reading is right, three things follow. First, sanctions aimed at changing Russian behavior are pushing on a state with progressively less room to act independently. The relevant decisions increasingly involve Beijing's tolerance, not only Moscow's calculation. Second, Russia's freedom of action abroad now runs through what China is willing to underwrite. A junior partner in an economic relationship does not get an unconstrained foreign policy, whatever the official language says. Third, and least discussed, this is difficult to reverse. Pipelines are fixed capital with 50-year horizons. Currency arrangements build institutional habit. Import dependency in machinery compounds as domestic capacity atrophies. Each year the pattern holds, the exit gets more expensive. So the shift I am describing is not a headline event. It happened through pipeline routing, settlement currency, and import composition, three unglamorous mechanisms that together did more to determine the balance of this relationship than any summit. I have laid out the evidence I find persuasive and the strongest objection I know of. If you think the lifeline reading is the better one, I would genuinely like to see the case made. The comment that changes my mind on this is worth more to me than the one that agrees. Next in this series, what China's own dependencies look like, and who holds leverage over Beijing.